September 15th, 1943, 9:27 a.m., Abwehr headquarters, Berlin. The manila folder landed on Oberst Friedrich Busch's mahogany desk with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the oak-paneled room like a death knell. Steam rose from his untouched coffee as his pale, scarred fingers traced the red Streng Geheim stamp across the cover, each letter seeming to burn under his touch. Inside lay 17 independent intelligence reports from agents across 3 continents, all confirming the same mathematically impossible conclusion about American industrial production that would shatter everything the Third Reich believed about their racial enemies. Busch's weathered face, marked by shrapnel scars from Verdun, contorted into a grimace of disbelief as he read the opening line of Agent 17's latest dispatch from Detroit. Ford's Willow Run facility now produces one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, containing 1.5 million individual parts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, using a workforce of 42,000 Americans, including 11,000 women and thousands of what the Reich considers inferior races. The colonel's hand trembled slightly, coffee growing cold, as he calculated the horrifying mathematics in his head, knowing that what lay before him represented either the greatest intelligence coup in German history or evidence that Germany was fighting an enemy whose true power they had catastrophically underestimated. 3 months earlier, Friedrich Busch had been among the Nazi leadership's most trusted intelligence analysts, a man whose reports from occupied Europe had helped orchestrate some of Germany's greatest early victories through precise enemy assessment and ruthless mathematical calculation of opposing forces' true capabilities and production limits. His reputation rested on an almost supernatural ability to separate propaganda from reality, to pierce through enemy deceptions and reveal the cold, hard facts that determined victory or defeat on the battlefield. Born in 1895 to a Prussian military family, Busch had learned early that wars were won not by courage alone, but by superior logistics, better intelligence, and accurate assessment of industrial capacity versus enemy resources and manufacturing potential. His Great War service as a reconnaissance officer had taught him that emotional thinking killed soldiers, while mathematical precision saved lives, and won campaigns through careful resource allocation and tactical planning. By 1943, he had successfully analyzed Soviet production capabilities, British convoy patterns, and American Lend-Lease shipments with devastating accuracy that helped German U-boats sink over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. His colleagues nicknamed him Der Rechner, the calculator, for his obsessive attention to numerical details that others overlooked, and his numbers to predict enemy movements based purely on logistical mathematics rather than traditional military intuition or ideological assumptions about racial superiority. But the Willow Run reports represented something entirely different, something that challenged not just German military assumptions, but the very foundation of National Socialist racial theory that underpinned the entire war effort and German understanding of their enemy's fundamental capabilities. According to Agent 17, a surviving member of Operation Pastorius, who had successfully evaded FBI capture and established deep cover in Detroit's automotive industry, Ford's massive Willow Run facility employed workers that Nazi ideology deemed inherently incapable of complex industrial production due to their racial inferiority and gender limitations. The reports described in excruciating detail how 11,000 American women, working alongside thousands of African Americans, Mexican immigrants, and other minorities, were assembling 4-engine heavy bombers with a precision and speed that exceeded Germany's most efficient aircraft factories by margins that seemed to defy basic industrial mathematics and everything the Reich believed about genetic determinism. Each B-24 Liberator required 1.5 million individual parts, from tiny screws and electrical components to massive wing sections, and 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines, producing 1,200 horsepower each. Yet these supposedly inferior workers were completing entire aircraft faster than German factories could build single-engine fighters using experienced Aryan craftsmen and slave laborers from across occupied Europe. The mathematical implications were staggering and deeply troubling to anyone who understood industrial warfare's true nature and the relationship between production capacity and ultimate victory on the battlefield. If Agent 17's reports were accurate, Ford's single Willow Run facility was outproducing Germany's entire aircraft industry, which included established manufacturers like Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Junkers, Heinkel, and Dornier combined, using a workforce that Nazi racial science insisted should be incapable of such sophisticated manufacturing processes due to genetic limitations and inferior mental capacity. Bush's calculations showed that at one bomber every 63 minutes, Willow Run alone would produce over 8,000 four-engine heavy bombers by war's end, each capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of explosives deep into German territory, with devastating accuracy and overwhelming firepower that could reduce German cities to rubble. This single American factory, operated by women and minorities, represented more strategic bombing capability than the entire Luftwaffe possessed at its peak strength during the Battle of Britain, when German air power had seemed invincible and capable of bringing England to its knees through sustained aerial bombardment and fighter superiority. Yet even more disturbing than the raw production numbers was the intelligence regarding American industrial methodology and organizational efficiency that suggested a fundamental transformation in manufacturing that German industry had completely failed to anticipate or understand. Agent 17 reported that Willow Run operated on principles of mass production and interchangeable parts that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier, but applied now to the most complex military hardware ever conceived, using assembly line techniques that allowed relatively unskilled workers to perform highly specialized tasks with mechanical precision and incredible speed through careful division of labor and standardization. The facility itself stretched over 3.5 million square feet under a single roof, making it the largest building in the world by floor area, containing mile-long assembly lines where B-24 bombers moved from raw materials to completed aircraft in a continuous flow that never stopped, day or night, throughout the entire war effort. German aircraft production, by contrast, still relied heavily on skilled craftsmen, building planes almost individually, using traditional methods that produced superior individual aircraft, but at volumes completely inadequate for industrial warfare on the scale America was apparently conducting against the Axis powers worldwide. The intelligence reports painted a picture of American industrial mobilization that seemed to violate everything German leadership understood about warfare, economics, and racial capabilities in modern industrial society and military production. According to 17 independent sources operating across North America, the United States had transformed its entire economy into a military production machine within 18 months of Pearl Harbor, converting automobile factories, appliance manufacturers, and consumer goods producers into sophisticated weapons plants capable of outproducing the combined industrial might of Germany, Italy, and Japan, while simultaneously maintaining civilian production levels that kept American morale high and consumer confidence strong. General Motors was producing aircraft engines, Chrysler manufactured tanks, and countless smaller companies had retooled to produce ammunition, weapons, and military equipment in quantities that defied German assumptions about American industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. The reports suggested that America's democratic, racially diverse society was proving more efficient at total war mobilization than Germany's authoritarian, racially homogeneous system, a conclusion that contradicted fundamental Nazi beliefs about superior Aryan organizational abilities and racial hierarchy in modern industrial competition. To understand why Bush's intelligence reports would be dismissed as impossible propaganda by Nazi leadership, one must comprehend the deep ideological foundation upon which the entire German war effort rested and the fundamental racial theories that shaped every strategic decision from the highest levels of government down to individual factory managers and military commanders in the field. National Socialist doctrine, as articulated by Hitler himself in Mein Kampf and reinforced through years of propaganda by Joseph Goebbels' ministry, insisted that industrial and military superiority flowed directly from racial purity and Aryan genetic advantages that made Germans naturally superior to all other peoples in organization, technology, and warfare capability. According to this worldview, Americans represented a mongrel nation of racial inferiors, weakened by democracy, corrupted by Jewish influence, and fundamentally incapable of the discipline and coordination required for modern industrial warfare against a racially pure, ideologically unified opponent like Nazi Germany. German propaganda consistently portrayed America as a nation of soft, materialistic consumers who lacked the warrior spirit necessary for total war, describing American soldiers as pampered and inexperienced compared to battle-hardened German veterans who had conquered most of Europe through superior tactics, equipment, and racial determination to achieve victory, regardless of cost or sacrifice. This racial ideology had seemed to be confirmed by Germany's spectacular early military successes across Europe, where German forces had defeated supposedly superior enemies through better organization, superior technology, and more effective military doctrine that emphasized speed, coordination, and concentrated firepower applied at decisive points. The Wehrmacht's lightning victories over Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Netherlands, and France had convinced Nazi leadership that Aryan superiority was not merely theoretical, but demonstrably true on the battlefield, where German racial advantages translated directly into military dominance over racially inferior opponents who possessed larger armies, more resources, and seemingly better strategic positions. Even the ongoing struggle against the Soviet Union, despite its enormous costs and uncertain outcome, reinforced German beliefs about racial hierarchy, since Nazi ideology explained Russian resistance not as evidence of Slavic capability, but as proof that Asiatic hordes could absorb tremendous casualties without achieving meaningful military success against Aryan tactical and technological superiority. Hermann Göring himself had publicly declared that American aircraft production claims were Luftnummern, lies pulled from thin air, because he genuinely believed that a racially mixed, democratic society could never achieve the organizational efficiency and industrial coordination that characterized German manufacturing under National Socialist guidance and Aryan leadership. The Reichsmarschall's confidence rested on seemingly solid evidence from Germany's own industrial achievements, which had transformed the nation from economic collapse in 1933 to Europe's dominant military power within 6 years through comprehensive rearmament and technological innovation that appeared to validate Nazi claims about Aryan industrial superiority. German aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 had dominated European skies. German tanks had crushed Allied armor in France, and German submarines were strangling British supply lines with U-boat technology that represented the pinnacle of underwater warfare design and tactical innovation. The Luftwaffe's early successes against the Royal Air Force, combined with devastating bombing campaigns against Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London, seemed to prove that German engineering and military science had achieved qualitative superiority that could overcome any quantitative advantages possessed by racially inferior enemies, relying on mass production rather than technical excellence. Göring's own experience as a World War I fighter ace and his role in building the Luftwaffe from nothing into Europe's most feared air force convinced him that he understood aviation better than any American politician or industrialist, regardless of their supposed production capabilities or manufacturing statistics. Furthermore, Nazi intelligence had consistently underestimated American capabilities because their racial assumptions prevented accurate assessment of democratic society's industrial potential and organizational adaptability in wartime conditions that required rapid transformation and efficient resource allocation. German agents in America before Pearl Harbor had reported on American isolationism, labor disputes, racial tensions, and political divisions that seemed to confirm Nazi beliefs about democratic weakness and racial disunity that would prevent effective military mobilization against disciplined, unified opponents fighting for clear ideological goals. The fact that America had required 2 years to enter the war, despite direct German submarine attacks on American shipping, seemed to prove American weakness and reluctance to engage in serious military confrontation with a determined, racially superior enemy prepared for total war. German propaganda portrayed President Roosevelt as a Jewish puppet, manipulating a reluctant nation into war against its natural interests, while American military leaders like General George Marshall were dismissed as inexperienced peacetime soldiers who had never faced battle-tested German commanders, schooled in the world's most demanding military tradition, and proven successful against Europe's best armies. The systematic nature of this ideological blindness meant that contradictory evidence was consistently reinterpreted to fit existing beliefs rather than challenging fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and German superiority in military and industrial affairs that formed the foundation of Nazi strategy and war planning. When Agent 17 first reported unusual activity at Ford's Willow Run facility in early 1942, his superiors in Berlin initially dismissed the reports as American propaganda designed to intimidate Germany and boost Allied morale through exaggerated production claims that no rational analysis could accept as genuine. The idea that American women and minorities could outproduce German aircraft factories seemed so fundamentally absurd to Nazi leadership that they assumed the reports represented deliberate misinformation, rather than accurate intelligence requiring strategic reassessment of American capabilities and German chances for ultimate victory in a prolonged industrial war. Even when multiple independent sources began confirming similar production figures from various American facilities, German intelligence analysts concluded that the Americans must be building inferior aircraft using shoddy construction methods that would prove inadequate in actual combat against superior German fighters and experienced Luftwaffe pilots trained to exploit any weaknesses in enemy equipment or tactical doctrine. This pattern of evidence denial extended throughout the German intelligence apparatus and military leadership, creating a systematic inability to accurately assess enemy capabilities that would prove catastrophic as the war progressed and American industrial production reached levels that exceeded even the most optimistic Allied projections made in 1941. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, had built his reputation on successful intelligence operations in South America and Europe. But his agents' reports from North America consistently conflicted with Nazi racial theory in ways that made accurate assessment impossible within the ideological framework that governed all German strategic thinking and military planning. When presented with evidence that contradicted fundamental beliefs about Aryan superiority, German leadership had three choices: accept that their racial theories were wrong, dismiss the evidence as false, or reinterpret the evidence to support existing beliefs regardless of logical consistency or factual accuracy. The institutional pressure within Nazi Germany made the first option politically and personally dangerous, while the second option seemed reasonable given the apparent impossibility of the reported American achievements compared to established German understanding of industrial and racial capabilities. The first cracks in German confidence began appearing in June 1942, when 8 German saboteurs landed on American shores as part of Operation Pastorius, named after Franz Daniel Pastorius, the founder of the first German settlement in America, with orders to conduct industrial sabotage against key American manufacturing facilities and infrastructure targets that supported the Allied war effort. These men, trained extensively by the Abwehr in explosive techniques, industrial sabotage, and deep cover operations, were intended to cripple American production through carefully targeted attacks on aluminum plants, railroad facilities, and aircraft factories that formed the backbone of American military-industrial mobilization against Germany and its Axis partners. However, within weeks of their arrival, several surviving members of the operation began sending intelligence reports back to Berlin that contained information far more valuable than any sabotage they might have accomplished. Detailed first-hand observations of American industrial capacity that contradicted every assumption German leadership held about their enemy's true capabilities and potential threat to German victory in the expanding global conflict. Agent 17, whose real identity remains classified in Abwehr archives, had successfully evaded FBI capture following the operation's compromise and established cover employment at Ford's River Rouge complex, where he gained access to production facilities and witnessed manufacturing processes that challenged fundamental Nazi beliefs about racial capabilities in modern industrial warfare. His first reports, transmitted through a network of German agents operating out of Mexico and Argentina, described American industrial mobilization in terms that seemed almost fantastical to intelligence analysts accustomed to European manufacturing limitations and German production capabilities that represented the pinnacle of Aryan industrial achievement. Agent 17 reported witnessing the conversion of civilian automobile production lines into military manufacturing facilities with a speed and efficiency that defied German understanding of industrial retooling processes, which typically required months or years of careful planning and gradual implementation by skilled engineers and experienced factory managers. At Ford alone, he observed massive assembly lines being reconfigured to produce aircraft engines, tank components, and other military equipment, while simultaneously maintaining civilian vehicle production levels that kept American morale high and demonstrated the nation's ability to fight a total war without requiring civilian sacrifices comparable to those demanded of German citizens. The American workforce, composed largely of women, minorities, and immigrants that Nazi racial theory dismissed as inherently inferior to Aryan workers, displayed levels of organization, technical competence, and productive efficiency that challenged every assumption about genetic determinism and racial hierarchy that formed the foundation of German strategic planning and military doctrine. Most troubling to German intelligence analysts was Agent 17's detailed description of American management techniques and production methodologies that suggested a fundamental revolution in manufacturing efficiency that German industry had failed to anticipate or match despite their supposed technological and organizational superiority. Ford's implementation of assembly line production for complex military equipment represented a quantum leap beyond traditional European manufacturing methods that relied heavily on skilled craftsmen and individual attention to detail, rather than standardized processes that allowed relatively unskilled workers to perform sophisticated tasks through careful division of labor and mechanical precision. Agent 17 reported that American factories operated 3 full shifts around the clock, utilizing lighting and ventilation systems that maintained productivity levels even during nighttime hours, while German facilities typically operated during daylight hours with limited night production due to blackout restrictions and energy conservation measures required by wartime resource limitations. The Americans had apparently solved logistical problems that German engineers considered insurmountable, creating supply chains that delivered raw materials to the front lines, materials and components to production facilities with clockwork precision that eliminated bottlenecks and maintained continuous workflow, regardless of external disruptions or strategic bombing campaigns that might target transportation infrastructure. The intelligence reports also revealed disturbing evidence of American technological innovation and research capabilities that suggested German assumptions about Aryan scientific superiority might be dangerously incorrect, particularly in areas like aviation technology, electronics, and industrial chemistry that would prove decisive in determining ultimate victory or defeat in modern warfare. Agent 17 described witnessing prototype aircraft with performance characteristics that exceeded anything in German service, powered by engines producing horsepower levels that German manufacturers considered impossible to achieve with existing materials and engineering techniques available during wartime conditions, with limited resources and constrained supply chains. American research facilities, staffed by scientists and engineers from diverse racial backgrounds that included Jewish refugees from Nazi persecution, were apparently making breakthrough discoveries in radar technology, communications equipment, and metallurgy that gave American forces significant advantages in detection, coordination, and equipment durability that could offset any tactical or strategic advantages possessed by German military forces through superior training or battlefield experience. The idea that racially inferior scientists could outperform German research institutions staffed by pure Aryan intellectuals represented a fundamental challenge to Nazi ideology that German leadership found impossible to accept or acknowledge without undermining their entire worldview and justification for the war itself. Perhaps most shocking to German intelligence was Agent 17's documentation of American industrial capacity that seemed to violate basic economic principles and resource limitations that constrained German production, despite access to occupied Europe's raw materials, slave labor, and industrial facilities captured during the Wehrmacht's successful campaigns. The United States was apparently producing military equipment in quantities that exceeded German estimates of American raw material availability, suggesting either that pre-war intelligence had drastically underestimated American natural resources or that American industry had achieved efficiency levels that allowed maximum utilization of available materials through recycling, substitution, and technological innovation that German industry had failed to match. Agent 17 reported witnessing massive stockpiles of aluminum, steel, and other strategic materials that German submarines were desperately trying to prevent from reaching British and Soviet forces through convoy interdiction campaigns that consumed enormous resources while failing to significantly impact American production levels or delivery schedules to Allied partners fighting on multiple fronts against Axis forces. The Americans were not only outproducing German expectations, but were simultaneously supplying massive quantities of equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations, while building their own military forces to levels that would allow direct confrontation with German forces on terms favorable to American industrial and technological advantages. The cumulative impact of these intelligence reports created cognitive dissonance within German military and political leadership that proved impossible to resolve within existing ideological frameworks that demanded Aryan superiority and inevitable German victory against racially inferior opponents, regardless of temporary tactical setbacks or strategic complications. Agent 17's reports were corroborated by intelligence from Swedish engineers working in American factories, Spanish diplomats with access to American industrial facilities, Japanese naval attachés monitoring American shipbuilding, and Mexican agents observing cross-border transportation of military equipment that confirmed American production levels far exceeding German intelligence estimates and strategic planning assumptions. Yet each confirming report only deepened German leadership's conviction that they were being deceived by elaborate American propaganda campaigns designed to undermine German morale and encourage premature peace negotiations that would deprive Germany of ultimate victory through persistence and superior racial determination to achieve their rightful position as Europe's dominant power through military conquest and territorial expansion. By autumn 1943, Oberst Busch possessed intelligence reports from 17 independent sources operating across North America, each providing detailed confirmation of American industrial capabilities that painted an increasingly terrifying picture of German strategic miscalculation and the mathematical impossibility of victory against an opponent whose true strength had been catastrophically underestimated by Nazi leadership and intelligence services. These sources represented a comprehensive intelligence network that Admiral Canaris had spent years developing across the Western Hemisphere, utilizing diplomatic contacts, commercial relationships, and ethnic German communities to gather information about American military preparations and industrial mobilization that would provide advance warning of Allied offensive capabilities and strategic intentions. However, instead of revealing American weaknesses that could be exploited for German advantage, the intelligence network had uncovered evidence of American strength so overwhelming that it challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which German war strategy and political ideology depended for coherence and popular support among the German people and military leadership, who had committed themselves to total war against supposedly inferior opponents. Agent 12, operating under diplomatic cover at the Mexican embassy in Washington, had gained access to congressional budget hearings and military appropriation discussions that revealed the true scale of American financial commitment to industrial mobilization and military production that dwarfed German military spending, even when calculated to include captured resources from occupied territories across Europe and North Africa. His reports documented American military appropriations exceeding $300 billion over 4 years, representing a financial commitment that exceeded Germany's entire gross national product, and suggested American economic capacity that German economists had dismissed as impossible, given their understanding of democratic inefficiency and the supposedly corrupting influence of Jewish financial manipulation on American monetary policy. The Americans were apparently financing massive military expansion while simultaneously maintaining civilian production levels, consumer goods availability, and living standards that kept American morale high and demonstrated the superiority of democratic capitalism over authoritarian socialism in mobilizing national resources for sustained military conflict against determined opponents, prepared for prolonged warfare and significant sacrifices to achieve ultimate victory. Agent 4, a Swedish engineer employed by General Motors to help retool civilian automobile production for military manufacturing, provided detailed technical reports about American production methodologies and industrial organization that revealed systematic advantages over German manufacturing that could not be explained by racial theory or ideological superiority, but seemed to result from superior management techniques and technological innovation that German industry had failed to develop or implement. His reports described American factories operating with precision and efficiency that exceeded German performance, despite utilizing workforce diversity that Nazi ideology insisted should create coordination problems, communication difficulties, and reduced productivity compared to racially homogeneous German workers, operating under unified ideological direction and clear hierarchical authority structures. The Americans had apparently solved complex logistical problems through application of scientific management principles and industrial engineering techniques that optimized workflow, minimized waste, and maximized output per worker hour through careful time-motion studies and systematic elimination of inefficient processes that plagued traditional European manufacturing methods. Agent 9, operating through Spanish diplomatic channels in Detroit and Chicago, documented American aircraft production at multiple facilities beyond Ford's Willow Run plant, reporting that Consolidated Aircraft, Boeing, Douglas, and other manufacturers were simultaneously producing different aircraft types in quantities that exceeded German estimates of total American aviation industry capacity based on pre-war intelligence assessments and ongoing analysis of American industrial potential. His reports indicated that American aircraft production had reached levels approaching 1,000 aircraft per month across all manufacturers, representing more strategic bombing capability than Germany could hope to defend against, using existing anti-aircraft resources and fighter aircraft production that was constrained by material shortages, skilled labor limitations, and strategic bombing campaigns that were beginning to disrupt German manufacturing, despite Luftwaffe efforts to maintain air superiority over occupied Europe and defend German industrial centers from Allied aerial attack. The Japanese naval attaché in San Francisco, Agent 15, according to German intelligence designation, provided reports about American shipbuilding capabilities that documented construction of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and cargo vessels in quantities that would allow simultaneous naval operations in both Pacific and Atlantic theaters, while maintaining convoy protection and amphibious assault capabilities that could support major offensive operations against defended positions. His reports indicated that American shipyards were launching vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them, despite successful submarine campaigns that had destroyed millions of tons of Allied shipping and threatened to strangle British supply lines connecting North America to European theaters of operation. The mathematics of American shipbuilding versus German submarine production suggested that Germany was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, despite tactical successes and innovative submarine technology that represented some of the most advanced underwater warfare capabilities ever developed by any navy in maritime history. Agent 6, a Mexican intelligence officer with access to American railroad transportation records, documented freight movements that revealed the true scale of American military production and logistics capabilities that were moving enormous quantities of equipment, ammunition, and supplies across continental distances with efficiency that German transportation systems could not match, despite superior railroad engineering and decades of experience in coordinating complex logistical operations across European theaters. His reports showed that American railroads were transporting military cargo in volumes that exceeded German estimates of American production capacity, suggesting either that previous intelligence assessments had dramatically underestimated American industrial output, or that American logistics efficiency allowed movement of goods in quantities that seemed impossible given German understanding of transportation limitations and the physical constraints of moving massive military equipment across transcontinental distances during wartime conditions, with potential sabotage threats and resource allocation competing with civilian transportation needs. Perhaps most disturbing to German intelligence analysts were reports from Agent 2, a German-American businessman with extensive contacts throughout American industrial leadership, who documented management attitudes and strategic planning discussions that revealed American confidence in ultimate victory based on mathematical calculations of production capacity versus Axis capabilities that painted a picture of inevitable Allied superiority in any prolonged industrial war of attrition. American industrial leaders were apparently making long-term investment decisions and production commitments that assumed years of continued warfare, suggesting strategic confidence that contradicted German assumptions about American casualty sensitivity and democratic war weariness that would force American withdrawal from European conflicts once German military capabilities demonstrated the true costs of confronting determined Axis resistance. The Americans seemed prepared for sustained military operations that would require enormous sacrifices and tremendous industrial output over periods that would test the resolve of any democratic society facing determined authoritarian opponents willing to accept unlimited casualties and economic hardship to achieve their strategic objectives through military conquest and territorial expansion. As Friedrich Busch studied the accumulated intelligence from his 17 sources throughout that cold Berlin autumn of 1943, a terrible mathematical certainty began crystallizing in his analytical mind that would haunt him for the remainder of his life and force him to confront the fundamental contradiction between empirical evidence and ideological belief that was destroying Germany's ability to conduct rational strategic planning in an increasingly desperate war against opponents whose true capabilities had been systematically underestimated and misunderstood. Each report, cross-referenced and verified through multiple independent sources operating without knowledge of each other's activities, painted the same inescapable picture of American industrial supremacy that rendered German victory mathematically impossible, regardless of tactical brilliance, strategic innovation, or ideological determination to achieve success through superior racial willpower and organizational efficiency that had characterized German military doctrine since the beginning of the conflict. The numbers were undeniable, brutal, and absolutely decisive in their implications for Germany's long-term strategic position and ultimate fate in a war that had become a contest of industrial production rather than battlefield heroism or military tradition. Busch's calculations, performed with the same methodical precision that had made him the Abwehr's most trusted analyst, revealed American production advantages so overwhelming that German military leadership would dismiss them as impossible propaganda rather than acknowledge strategic realities that demanded immediate peace negotiations before Germany's position became completely hopeless and unconditional surrender became the only alternative to national destruction through sustained Allied bombing campaigns and eventual ground invasion. Ford's Willow Run facility alone, producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes around the clock, would deliver over 8,000 four-engine heavy bombers by war's end, each capable of carrying 4 tons of explosives across distances that would bring every German city within range of sustained strategic bombing campaigns that could reduce German industrial capacity to rubble and break civilian morale through unprecedented destruction of urban centers and manufacturing facilities. This single American factory, operated primarily by women and minorities that Nazi racial theory dismissed as inherently inferior, possessed more strategic bombing capability than the entire German aircraft industry could produce over the same time period using experienced Aryan workers, slave laborers from occupied territories, and captured industrial facilities across conquered Europe that had once represented the pinnacle of European manufacturing technology and organizational efficiency. The mathematical comparison became even more devastating when Bush expanded his analysis beyond aviation to encompass total American industrial mobilization across all sectors of military production, revealing productive capacity that exceeded German estimates by margins that seemed to violate basic economic principles and resource availability constraints that limited industrial output in any rational economic system operating under wartime conditions. American steel production had reached levels approaching 90 million tons annually, compared to German production of 35 million tons, including captured facilities and slave labor utilization that had maximized German access to European raw materials and manufacturing capabilities through military conquest and territorial occupation. American aluminum production, essential for aircraft manufacturing, exceeded German capacity by ratios exceeding 10 to 1, explaining how American aircraft manufacturers could simultaneously increase production while maintaining quality standards that German intelligence reports grudgingly acknowledged matched or exceeded German aircraft performance, despite utilizing mass production techniques rather than traditional craftsmanship methods that characterize German aviation industry practices and engineering philosophy. The implications extended far beyond simple production statistics to encompass fundamental questions about technological innovation, scientific research, and engineering capabilities that determined military effectiveness in modern warfare, where superior equipment often proved more decisive than tactical skill or strategic brilliance in determining battle outcomes and campaign success. Agent reports consistently documented American technological advances in radar, communications, electronics, and metallurgy that suggested German assumptions about Aryan scientific superiority were not merely incorrect, but dangerously delusional, preventing accurate assessment of enemy capabilities and realistic strategic planning based on empirical evidence rather than ideological wishful thinking that had characterized German intelligence analysis since the beginning of the war. The most devastating realization for Bush was not simply that American industrial capacity exceeded German estimates, but that Nazi racial ideology made accurate intelligence assessment impossible within the existing command structure and political system that governed German strategic decision-making at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Every intelligence report that contradicted fundamental Nazi beliefs about racial hierarchy and Aryan superiority would be automatically dismissed as enemy propaganda or deliberate misinformation, rather than factual evidence requiring strategic reassessment and policy modification based on mathematical realities that determined ultimate victory or defeat in industrial warfare. Bush understood that he could present irrefutable documentation of American industrial supremacy to Reichsmarschall Göring, Adolf Hitler, and the entire German High Command, but that ideological conditioning would prevent acceptance of evidence that challenged core Nazi beliefs about genetic determinism and racial capabilities in modern technological society, and military competition between democratic and authoritarian systems of government and social organization. The colonel's hands trembled as he drafted his preliminary assessment for Admiral Canaris, knowing that accurate reporting would be dismissed as defeatist thinking, while false optimism would contribute to strategic decisions based on incorrect assumptions about American capabilities and German chances for ultimate victory through sustained resistance and eventual negotiated settlement, favorable to German territorial and political objectives. The mathematical certainty of German defeat, calculated with the same precision that had made his previous intelligence assessments invaluable for German military planning, could not be communicated effectively to leadership whose worldview depended on German superiority and inevitable victory against racially inferior opponents, regardless of temporary material disadvantages or tactical setbacks that might delay but could never prevent ultimate Aryan triumph through superior organization and racial determination to achieve their destined position as Europe's dominant power. Bush realized that he was witnessing the intellectual suicide of an entire nation, watching Germany's leadership choose ideological comfort over mathematical truth in ways that would ensure national catastrophe and the destruction of everything they claimed to be fighting to preserve and protect. The same racial theories that had initially motivated German confidence in military aggression were now preventing rational assessment of strategic realities that demanded immediate policy changes and negotiated settlement before Germany's position became completely hopeless and unconditional surrender became inevitable through Allied industrial supremacy and overwhelming material advantages that would eventually crush German resistance, regardless of tactical skill or strategic innovation that characterized German military doctrine and battlefield performance throughout the European campaigns. The irony was almost unbearable for an intelligence officer trained to value objective analysis above personal comfort or political convenience in assessing enemy capabilities and strategic threats that determine national survival in modern warfare. Germany's greatest intelligence coup, the comprehensive documentation of American industrial capacity through 17 independent sources operating across multiple continents, would become useless information because the political system that had commissioned the intelligence gathering could not psychologically accept evidence that contradicted fundamental beliefs about racial superiority and inevitable German victory that formed the foundation of Nazi ideology and popular support for continued warfare, despite mounting casualties and increasing material hardships experienced by German civilians and military personnel fighting on multiple fronts against enemies whose true strength had been systematically underestimated and misunderstood. October 28, 1943, 2:15 p.m., Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's private office, Karen Hall. The leather portfolio containing Bush's comprehensive intelligence assessment landed on Göring's massive oak desk with a decisive thud that seemed to echo through the hunting lodge's trophy-lined walls, each mounted head serving as a silent witness to the moment when mathematical truth would collide with ideological delusion in a confrontation that would seal Germany's fate and demonstrate the fatal consequences of choosing racial fantasy over empirical evidence in strategic military planning. Göring's corpulent frame, draped in a powder blue Luftwaffe uniform, adorned with medals from a more successful era, shifted uncomfortably in his custom chair as he scanned the executive summary that began with the stark declaration. American industrial capacity exceeds German estimates by margins that render continued resistance mathematically futile and strategically suicidal for the German Reich and its allies. The Reichsmarshal's face, already flushed from his morning morphine injection and afternoon champagne consumption, darkened to a dangerous crimson as he read Bush's clinical assessment that Ford's Willow Run facility alone possessed more strategic bombing capability than Germany's entire aircraft industry, operated by racial inferiors who were supposedly incapable of the organizational discipline and technical competence required for sophisticated military production. In modern industrial warfare against superior Aryan opponents. Goering's initial reaction was explosive and predictable, combining personal outrage at having his professional judgment questioned with ideological fury at suggestions that racially inferior Americans could outperform German industry and engineering that represented the pinnacle of Aryan technological achievement and organizational efficiency, developed through decades of careful planning and systematic improvement of manufacturing methods and quality control processes. This is impossible Jewish propaganda designed to undermine German morale and encourage defeatist thinking among our military leadership, he shouted, his voice echoing through Karen Hall's corridors, where uniformed adjutants pretended not to hear their commanders' increasingly hysterical denunciation of intelligence reports that contradicted fundamental Nazi beliefs about racial hierarchy and inevitable German victory through superior Aryan capabilities in military competition and industrial production. The Reichsmarshal's hands, adorned with rings looted from conquered territories, shook as he flipped through pages of detailed production statistics, technological assessments, and comparative analyses that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Germany's strategic position and ultimate prospects for survival in a war that had become a contest of industrial mathematics rather than battlefield courage or tactical innovation that had characterized earlier German military successes across European theaters of operation. The mathematical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, documented through multiple independent sources whose credibility Goering had never previously questioned when their intelligence supported German strategic assumptions and military planning that had achieved spectacular early victories through superior tactics, equipment, and organizational efficiency. Agent 17's detailed reports from Ford's Willow Run facility described production processes and output levels that exceeded German aircraft manufacturing by margins that seemed to violate basic industrial principles and economic constraints that limited production capacity in any rational economic system operating under wartime resource limitations and material shortages that affected all belligerent nations engaged in sustained military conflict. The Americans were producing one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, containing 1.5 million individual parts manufactured to precision specifications that matched or exceeded German quality standards, while utilizing assembly line techniques that allowed relatively unskilled workers to perform complex tasks through systematic division of labor and mechanical standardization that German industry had failed to implement despite decades of engineering expertise and manufacturing experience. Yet Goering's response to this overwhelming evidence revealed the fundamental psychological mechanism that would ensure Germany's strategic defeat, regardless of tactical capabilities or military innovation that might delay but could never prevent ultimate Allied victory through superior industrial capacity and technological development, supported by democratic societies capable of sustained mobilization without requiring the authoritarian control and ideological indoctrination that characterized German war effort and civilian sacrifice. Rather than acknowledging mathematical realities that demanded immediate strategic reassessment and possible negotiated settlement before Germany's position became completely hopeless, the Reichsmarschall chose to reinterpret the evidence within existing ideological frameworks that preserved Nazi racial theories at the cost of accurate strategic planning and rational decision-making based on empirical assessment of enemy capabilities and German prospects for ultimate success through continued resistance against overwhelming material odds. These production figures represent inferior American aircraft, built with shoddy construction methods and inadequate quality control that will prove useless in actual combat against superior German fighters piloted by experienced Luftwaffe veterans trained in the world's most demanding military aviation program, Goering declared, his voice regaining confidence as he found ideological explanations that allowed him to dismiss mathematical evidence without acknowledging fundamental contradictions between Nazi racial theory and observable reality. The Reichsmarschall's analysis continued with increasing conviction, arguing that American mass production techniques necessarily compromised aircraft quality and performance characteristics that would become apparent once German pilots engaged these inferior machines in actual combat conditions, where superior Aryan training and tactical innovation would demonstrate clear advantages over racially mixed American crews flying equipment manufactured by women and minorities, supposedly incapable of the precision and attention to detail required for effective military hardware production under wartime conditions. This ideological reinterpretation allowed Goering to maintain psychological comfort and political position while systematically ignoring intelligence that demanded radical strategic reassessment and immediate policy changes that might have prevented Germany's ultimate destruction through sustained Allied bombing campaigns and eventual ground invasion that would reduce German cities to rubble and force unconditional surrender under terms dictated by victorious enemies whose industrial supremacy had been accurately documented, but politically unacceptable to acknowledge. The Reichsmarshal ordered Bush's intelligence assessment to be classified as defeatist propaganda and demanded that future reports focus on American weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited for German advantage, rather than documenting enemy strengths that challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions about racial capabilities and inevitable German victory through superior Aryan determination and organizational efficiency that had characterized German military culture since the beginning of the conflict against supposedly inferior democratic opponents. The consequences of Göring's ideological dismissal of accurate intelligence became horrifically apparent over the following 18 months, as American industrial production reached levels that exceeded even Bush's most pessimistic projections and transformed the strategic balance of World War II in ways that made German defeat not merely probable, but mathematically inevitable. Through sustained Allied bombing campaigns and overwhelming material superiority that crushed German resistance, despite tactical innovations and desperate strategic gambits designed to offset American industrial advantages. By December 1944, Ford's Willow Run facility had vindicated every detail of Agent 17's dismissed intelligence reports, producing its 8,000th B-24 Liberator bomber while simultaneously expanding production capacity and improving manufacturing efficiency through technological innovations and organizational improvements that demonstrated American industrial capabilities far exceeded initial German intelligence estimates that had been rejected as impossible enemy propaganda rather than accurate assessment, requiring immediate strategic reassessment and policy modification. The mathematical prophecy that Bush had documented with clinical precision was fulfilling itself with terrifying accuracy across every sector of American military production, revealing industrial mobilization on a scale that dwarfed German capabilities despite access to conquered European resources, slave labor from occupied territories, and captured manufacturing facilities that had once represented the pinnacle of continental European industrial achievement and technological sophistication. American aircraft production had reached monthly levels exceeding 9,000 military aircraft of all types, including heavy bombers, fighters, transport planes, and specialized military aircraft that provided Allied forces with air superiority over every theater of operations where German forces attempted to maintain defensive positions or conduct offensive operations against enemies possessing overwhelming advantages in equipment quality, quantity, and technological innovation that German industry could not match, despite decades of engineering expertise and manufacturing experience developed through careful planning and systematic improvement of production methods. American shipbuilding had achieved production levels that allowed simultaneous naval operations in Atlantic and Pacific theaters, while maintaining convoy protection and amphibious assault capabilities that supported major offensive operations against defended Axis positions throughout Europe and the Pacific, demonstrating logistical coordination and industrial efficiency that German military planners had dismissed as impossible, given their understanding of democratic inefficiency and the organizational challenges inherent in coordinating complex military operations across multiple theaters using diverse personnel and equipment, manufactured by racially mixed workforces, supposedly incapable of the precision and discipline required for effective military production. The United States Navy was commissioning aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels at rates that exceeded German submarine production and sinking capabilities, ensuring that American naval forces would dominate oceanic transportation and provide maritime support for land-based operations that would eventually bring Allied ground forces into direct contact with German defensive positions along fortified coastlines that had been prepared for years to resist invasion attempts. The strategic bombing campaign that Bush had predicted based on mathematical analysis of American bomber production was systematically destroying German industrial capacity and civilian morale through sustained aerial attacks that German air defenses proved incapable of preventing, despite technological innovations, tactical adaptations, and desperate resource allocation that prioritized anti-aircraft weapons and fighter aircraft production over other military needs that were equally essential for continued resistance against Allied ground forces and naval operations. German cities were experiencing nightly bombing raids that reduced urban areas to rubble, while targeting specific industrial facilities that supported German war production, demonstrating American ability to conduct precision bombing operations using radar technology, navigation equipment, and bombardment techniques that German intelligence had failed to anticipate or adequately assess when evaluating enemy capabilities and potential threats to German homeland security and civilian population centers. The human cost of ideological blindness was becoming apparent in German casualty reports, refugee movements, and civilian morale assessments that documented the systematic collapse of German society under sustained Allied pressure that German military forces proved incapable of preventing or significantly reducing, despite tactical skill and strategic innovation that had characterized German military performance throughout earlier phases of the conflict, when German advantages in training, equipment, and organizational efficiency had provided decisive advantages over less prepared opponents. German military personnel were reporting equipment shortages, ammunition limitations, and fuel restrictions that prevented effective defensive operations against Allied forces, possessing unlimited supplies of superior equipment manufactured by American industrial facilities that continued expanding production capacity while improving quality standards and technological sophistication that gave Allied forces overwhelming advantages in every category of military effectiveness and operational capability. Perhaps most tragically, the intelligence network that had provided accurate assessment of American capabilities was being systematically dismantled by German security services, who interpreted agent reports as defeatist propaganda rather than valuable information that might have informed strategic decisions and policy modifications that could have minimized German losses and civilian suffering through negotiated settlement before Germany's position became completely hopeless and unconditional surrender became inevitable through Allied military superiority and industrial dominance. Agent 17, whose detailed reports from Ford's Willow Run facility had provided the most accurate assessment of American bomber production capabilities, was recalled to Germany and executed as a defeatist and possible double agent, rather than being recognized as an intelligence officer whose professional competence and analytical accuracy had provided German leadership with information that might have prevented national catastrophe through realistic strategic planning based on empirical evidence rather than ideological fantasy about racial superiority and inevitable German victory against supposedly inferior opponents. The final vindication of Bush's mathematical analysis came in May 1945, when German military forces surrendered unconditionally to Allied commanders whose industrial supremacy had been accurately documented 3 years earlier, but dismissed as impossible propaganda by German leadership, whose ideological commitment to racial theories prevented rational assessment of strategic realities and mathematical certainties that determined ultimate victory or defeat in modern industrial warfare between democratic and authoritarian societies, competing for global dominance through military conquest and territorial expansion. In the shattered ruins of Berlin, May 8, 1945, as Soviet artillery shells exploded in the distance and American bombers completed their final missions over a defeated Germany, Oberst Friedrich Busch sat in his underground bunker, reading the final production statistics that vindicated every mathematical calculation he had presented to German leadership 18 months earlier, when accurate intelligence might have prevented the catastrophic destruction that now surrounded him, and the complete collapse of everything Nazi Germany had claimed to represent and defend through superior racial organization and inevitable Aryan victory against inferior opponents. Ford's Willow Run facility had produced exactly 8,685 B-24 Liberator bombers by war's end, each containing 1.5 million precision-manufactured parts assembled by 42,000 American workers, including 11,000 women and thousands of racial minorities that Nazi ideology had dismissed as inherently incapable of sophisticated industrial production, yet who had outproduced Germany's entire aircraft industry while simultaneously supporting massive military operations across multiple theaters of global warfare that had systematically dismantled Axis military capabilities and territorial conquests through overwhelming material superiority and technological innovation. The mathematical precision of American industrial achievement stood in stark contrast to the ideological delusions that had prevented German leadership from acknowledging empirical reality and making strategic decisions based on factual assessment rather than racial fantasy that had characterized Nazi political culture and military planning throughout the war effort. American total aircraft production had exceeded 300,000 military aircraft of all types, compared to German production of approximately 120,000 aircraft, despite access to conquered European industrial facilities, slave labor from occupied territories, and captured raw materials that had once seemed to provide decisive advantages over democratic opponents, supposedly weakened by racial diversity and political disunity, that Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed as fundamental weaknesses in American society and military organization. The Americans had not merely matched German production levels, but had exceeded them by margins that demonstrated the mathematical impossibility of German victory in any prolonged industrial conflict where superior manufacturing capacity would ultimately determine strategic outcomes, regardless of tactical brilliance or ideological motivation. The broader implications extended far beyond simple production statistics to encompass fundamental questions about political systems, social organization, and human capabilities that would reshape global power relationships and ideological competition for decades following Germany's unconditional surrender to Allied forces whose industrial supremacy had been accurately documented but systematically ignored by German leadership, committed to racial theories that prevented rational strategic planning and realistic assessment of enemy capabilities in modern technological warfare. American success had been achieved through democratic mobilization of diverse populations working voluntarily for common objectives, rather than through authoritarian control and ideological indoctrination that characterized German war effort and social organization under Nazi political systems that claimed superior efficiency through racial homogeneity and centralized command structures that eliminated individual initiative and creative innovation in favor of rigid hierarchical obedience to predetermined ideological principles. The human cost of ideological blindness was evident throughout defeated Germany, where millions of civilians and military personnel had died unnecessarily in a war that mathematical analysis had shown to be unwinnable once American industrial mobilization reached full capacity and Allied forces gained access to unlimited supplies of superior equipment, manufactured by supposedly inferior workers whose actual capabilities had exceeded German performance. despite every theoretical advantage that Nazi racial science had claimed would ensure Aryan victory through genetic superiority and organizational efficiency. German cities lay in ruins, German industry was destroyed, and German society faced complete reconstruction under Allied occupation that would systematically eliminate Nazi political influence and ideological education that had prevented accurate assessment of strategic realities and mathematical certainties that determined ultimate victory or defeat in modern industrial warfare between competing political systems and social organizations. Bush understood that he had witnessed the intellectual suicide of an entire civilization, watching German leadership choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths in ways that had guaranteed national catastrophe and the destruction of everything they had claimed to be fighting to preserve and protect through military conquest and territorial expansion, based on assumptions about racial superiority that had proven completely false when tested against empirical evidence and mathematical analysis of comparative industrial capabilities and technological innovation. The same racial theories that had initially motivated German confidence and military aggression had ultimately prevented rational strategic planning and realistic assessment of enemy capabilities that might have avoided total defeat through negotiated settlement before Germany's position became completely hopeless, and unconditional surrender became inevitable through Allied material supremacy and overwhelming industrial advantages. The final irony was almost unbearable for an intelligence officer who had dedicated his professional life to accurate assessment and objective analysis of strategic threats and enemy capabilities that determined national survival in modern warfare. Germany's most comprehensive intelligence operation, the systematic documentation of American industrial capacity through 17 independent sources operating across multiple continents for over 2 years, had become completely useless information because the political system that had commissioned the intelligence gathering could not psychologically accept evidence that contradicted fundamental beliefs about racial hierarchy and inevitable German superiority over democratic opponents whose true strength had been accurately measured, but ideologically impossible to acknowledge without undermining the entire Nazi worldview and popular support for continued warfare despite mounting casualties and increasing destruction. As Bush prepared to surrender to advancing Allied forces, he reflected on the ultimate lesson that German defeat had demonstrated with mathematical certainty and tragic finality. When ideology contradicts empirical evidence, when racial fantasy conflicts with industrial mathematics, when political comfort takes precedence over strategic reality, the result is not merely military defeat, but civilizational catastrophe that destroys everything the ideology claimed to protect through superior organization and inevitable victory against supposedly inferior opponents, whose actual capabilities exceeded every theoretical advantage that ideological delusion had promised would ensure success through racial determination and authoritarian efficiency.